On the night of March 9, 1945, Japan looked up at the sky and saw nothing. No stars, no moon. Only hundreds of silent shadows drifting above them, shaping a firestorm unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. This was the moment Japan realized the B-29 Superfortress wasn't just another bomber. It was the weapon that would break the empire's backbone. Let us rewind the clock. It's mid-1944. Japan's empire stretches across the Pacific, but the foundations are cracking. Their navy has been crippled after the Marianas turkey shoot. Their pilots are under-trained, their fuel reserves evaporating, and their industries strained to the breaking point. Yet Japan still believes firmly that the war can be prolonged, perhaps even turned. Why? Because the United States has not yet touched the Japanese homeland with sustained strategic bombing. That is about to change. And the instrument of that change is a machine the Japanese command never fully understood until it was far too late. A machine born out of frustration, ambition, and billions of dollars. The most advanced aircraft the world had ever seen, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was not just another bomber, it was a flying revolution. Pressurized cabins that allowed crews to fly at 30,000 feet, remote-controlled gun turrets, 3,250-mile range, more than anything in the world, a bomb load that dwarfed anything before it. It was so advanced, so typical, and so expensive that General Hop Arnold once said, "The B-29 is the most complicated weapon of war ever devised." By the time it was ready, the U.S. had poured what would be billions in today's dollars into its development. But this aircraft had one purpose: go where no American bomber had ever gone before. Tokyo. Japanese commanders knew the Americans were developing a long-range bomber, but they believed several things. The bomber would be unreliable. Operating at high altitude over Japan's weather systems would be impossible. Japanese air defenses, especially the feared 88mm guns and night fighters, would stop any large-scale effort. And perhaps most importantly, they believed the Americans wouldn't risk massive losses for distant, dangerous raids. They were wrong on every single point. When the first wave of B-29s appeared over Japan from bases in China in mid-1944, the Japanese believed it was a fluke. Small raids, long travel times, inaccurate bombing, but that was only the beginning. America had a far more devastating plan in motion. The turning point came when us Marines captured the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were not just stepping stones. They were the throne from which the B-29 would dominate the empire. From the Marianas, Japan lay within comfortable striking distance. And over the next months, the U.S. would build some of the largest airfields in the world, purely for the B-29 fleet. To Japan's shock, the Americans turned the Marianas into a massive, unstoppable aerial hammer. By late 1944, hundreds of B-29s lined the runways, their engines growling day and night. Crews trained relentlessly. Engineers fine-tuned every detail. The stage was set. The B-29 was ready, not for pinprick raids, but for industrial annihilation. In January 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces put one man in charge of the entire strategic bombing campaign against Japan. General Curtis LeMay was blunt, ruthless, and brutally efficient. To him, the war was simple. If we lose, we'll be tried as war criminals. But if we win, no one will ask. And LeMay wasn't satisfied with high-altitude bombing. He believed Japan's cities built of wood and paper were the perfect targets for a different kind of strategy. A strategy the Japanese didn't believe America would ever attempt. What happened next would become one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history, and it would change the entire outcome of the Pacific War. Japan had underestimated the B-29. They had underestimated America's resolve, and they had underestimated Curtis LeMay, because what was about to happen would rewrite the rules of warfare forever. Before the fires of Tokyo lit the night sky, before entire cities vanished beneath waves of flame, the B-29 campaign began with frustration, failure, and a desperate search for the right strategy. Because the B-29, for all its power, was not easy to tame. And the Japanese, still confident in their defenses, believed they had more time than they actually did. The B-29 program was a masterpiece of engineering, but also a nightmare for the crews who had to operate it. Engines overheated, cooling systems failed, fuel leaks were common, and the long flights from China to Japan stretched every limit of the aircraft's endurance. In the summer of 1944, the U.S. launched Operation Matterhorn, the first attempt to bomb Japan using bases in western China. On paper, it sounded brilliant. In reality, it was nearly impossible. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be flown in over the Himalayas, a route so dangerous that pilots called it the aluminum trail because of the wreckage that littered the mountainsides. A massive logistical effort just to get a few dozen B-29s over Japan. The results? Frustratingly small, inaccurate, costly. The Japanese commanders monitored these first raids. Their conclusion? America cannot sustain this. Their bomber is powerful, but their distance is too great. And for a moment, Japan seemed right. But America had no intention of stopping. Instead, Washington was preparing a move that Japan never saw coming. When the U.S. seized Saipan, Tainan, and Guam in mid-1944, Japan's leadership was stunned. These islands weren't supposed to fall. They were considered part of Japan's inner defensive ring, the impregnable shield around the homeland. But once they fell, everything changed. Engineers, Seabees, and construction crews swarmed across the islands. Within months, the Americans built Northfield on Tinian, the largest airbase on Earth. Multiple 8,000-foot runways, concrete taxiways capable of holding hundreds of heavy bombers, massive fuel depots, entire villages and support towns for tens of thousands of airmen. Japan watched from afar as the Marianas transformed into what one Japanese admiral later described as a giant anvil upon which our cities would be hammered. From these airfields, B-29s could hit Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and every major industrial center without relying on China, without flying over the Himalayas, and without stretching their range to the limit. Japan's defensive perimeter had collapsed, but the worst was still to come. The first B-29 attacks from the Marianas began in November 1944. At first, Japanese commanders believed they could handle it. They still had anti-aircraft guns. They still had night fighters and radar warning systems. They still believed altitude was their ally. But the B-29s flew higher than any Japanese fighter could reliably intercept. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden and KD-4 Frank could sometimes reach the bombers, but only barely, and often too late. The anti-aircraft guns, almost useless at 30,000 feet, Japanese technicians were shocked to discover that their 88mm guns, deadly against medium bombers, simply couldn't reach the B-29s effectively. Shells exploded far beneath the bombers, bursting harmlessly in the thin air below. One Japanese air defense officer wrote in his diary, "We could see them, but we could not touch them." Worse yet, the B-29 crews were improving. Their formations tightened, their accuracy increased, their confidence grew with every mission. Japan was beginning to realize that this was no ordinary bombing campaign. This was systematic devastation, planned, calculated, and unrelenting. However, there was a major challenge that threatened the entire campaign: the jet stream. Japan is one of the few nations directly under a powerful, high-altitude river of air. U.S. crews discovered winds of 150 to 200 miles per hour blowing across their bombing routes. Bombs dropped from 30,000 feet, drifted miles off target. Entire formations were scattered. The Japanese considered this their natural defense, a gift from the heavens. And for a time, it was. But the Americans adapted. Meteorologists were brought in. New techniques were tested. Radar bombing was refined. Crews trained to account for the jet stream. The B-29 wasn't just a machine. It was a platform for innovation. Japan didn't expect America to adjust this fast. They thought weather alone would cripple the campaign. They were wrong, again. By early 1945, the U.S. High Command was impatient. The B-29 was powerful, but the results weren't matching expectations. So Washington gave command of the entire bombing effort to one man, Major General Curtis LeMay. LeMay was relentless, cold, methodical, and absolutely determined to break Japan's industrial backbone. His first order of business: throw out the rulebook. He experimented relentlessly. Low-altitude raids, different formations, different target priorities, new incendiaries. He pushed his crews hard. He pushed his machines harder. And soon, he would settle on a strategy that would plunge Japan into a nightmare. A strategy the Japanese High Command never imagined the Americans would dare attempt. A strategy that would leave entire cities burning within hours. By early 1945, Japan was beginning to understand the nightmare they faced. The B-29 raids were no longer small strikes. They were organized, relentless, and terrifyingly efficient. And yet, what was coming next would shock the Japanese military beyond belief. This is the story of how America's bomber strategy went from frustrating raids to total devastation, a campaign meticulously engineered to break both cities and morale. At first, B-29 raids focused on precision bombing. Factories, military installations, and key infrastructure were targeted. But the Japanese quickly realized a troubling truth. Their cities were largely wooden. Traditional high-explosive bombs did relatively little damage to sprawling residential and industrial districts. Enter General Curtis LeMay, a man whose vision would redefine strategic bombing. LeMay made a radical decision: abandon high-altitude precision for low-altitude night raids. Use incendiary bombs instead of conventional explosives. Target entire urban areas, not just factories. The Japanese military had never faced anything like this. Their cities, densely packed, wooden, and highly flammable, became death traps almost overnight. The night of March 9, 1945, began quietly. Japanese radar picked up dozens of American aircraft approaching the capital, but what the Japanese couldn't comprehend was the scale. By midnight, B-29s dropped incendiary clusters weighing thousands of pounds across Tokyo's districts. The result? Flames merging into walls of fire, temperatures soaring above 10 degrees Celsius in pockets. Millions fleeing in terror. An Imperial Army officer wrote later, "The city burned like a river of molten gold. There was no defense, no hope." This was not a typical raid. It was a firestorm, a term the Japanese had never encountered in warfare. Entire neighborhoods vanished in hours. People died not from bombs, but from heat, smoke, and chaos. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Japan's confidence shattered overnight. For Japanese generals, this was unthinkable. They had expected industrial attrition, not urban annihilation. They had prepared anti-aircraft defenses, fighter intercepts, and civil evacuation plans, but none of it worked. One senior officer noted, "Our entire defensive doctrine was rendered meaningless. The Americans were not just bombing our cities, they were burning our very spirit." Reports from local commanders flooded Tokyo. Communications cut, fire brigades destroyed or overwhelmed civilians trapped in streets as flames consumed entire blocks. The horror was compounded by the B-29's speed and altitude. Japanese fighters could rarely reach them, and flak often exploded harmlessly below. For the first time, the Japanese military realized they were technologically outmatched in ways they could not counter. Japan's surprise wasn't just from the bombing itself, it was from the precision of the campaign. The U.S. had learned from early failures. Airfields in the Marianas allowed shorter, more efficient flight paths, bombing altitudes adjusted for maximum incendiary effect. Reconnaissance flights mapped every city's flammable districts. Crews were trained to deploy bombs in patterns designed to merge fires into uncontrollable infernos from Tokyo to Osaka to Nagoya. No city was safe. The Japanese high command faced a terrifying reality. Every major urban center, every industrial district, was now within the reach of American air power. The human toll was unimaginable. Tokyo, over 100,000 civilians dead, more than 1 million homeless. Firestorms in other cities, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, tens of thousands more killed, hospitals destroyed, shelters burned, families lost in flames. Witnesses described surreal scenes. The fire moved faster than we could run. Children screamed. Streets became rivers of fire. There was no end in sight for Japanese civilians. The B-29 was not a symbol of military power. It was apocalyptic terror from above. The psychological impact on Japanese soldiers was equally profound. Officers reported morale plummeting. Soldiers feared returning to cities they no longer recognized. 2 towns now ashes. The Japanese military tried everything. Kamikaze fighters, desperate counterattacks were launched against incoming B-29's night fighters. Mitsubishi J-2Ms and Nakajima KT-4s intercepted, but suffered heavy losses. Anti-aircraft artillery, 75mm and 88mm, guns couldn't reach the bombers' altitude effectively. Even as losses mounted among American crews, the B-29s returned again and again. Japanese commanders began to realize the terrifying truth. They had no way to stop the raids. Industrial output slowed, but destruction wasn't limited to factories. Civilians were demoralized, unable to sustain daily life. Entire urban centers were uninhabitable. It was a war of attrition the Japanese had never planned for, a war waged from the skies with devastating efficiency. By the spring of 1945, the Japanese military was grappling with a horrifying reality. Cities burned, civilians perished, and defenses failed at every turn. But the full scale of America's strategy, the calculated, relentless destruction designed to end the war swiftly, had yet to be unleashed. Spring of 1945, Japan's cities were burning, yet the war still raged. Curtis LeMay was refining a strategy that would leave no city untouched, no factory safe, and no civilian unshaken. Japan's military command was forced to face a grim truth. They were losing the war in the skies, on the ground, and in the hearts of their people. This is the story of how the B-29 campaign escalated, shattered expectations, and pushed the Japanese defense to the breaking point. LeMay's innovation was audacious. The high-altitude precision raids had proven inefficient due to the jet stream and unpredictable Japanese weather, so he ordered a dramatic change: low-altitude night raids. Flying just 5,000 to 9,000 feet, B-29 crews now could drop M69 incendiary bombs in tight clusters, exploit the wooden construction of Japanese urban centers, ensure firestorms would merge and spread uncontrollably. Japanese commanders were bewildered. Their anti-aircraft artillery, optimized for high-altitude targets, was largely ineffective. Night fighters struggled to intercept bombers in coordinated waves. One officer later recalled, "We could hear the engines approach, see the faint glow of fires, but by the time our fighters climbed, the city below had already begun to burn beyond recognition." The B-29 was no longer just a bomber. It had become an instrument of total urban destruction. The March 9th to 10th firebombing of Tokyo was only the beginning. LeMay applied the same tactics to other major cities. Osaka and Nagoya. Firestorms destroyed munitions factories and residential zones alike. Kobe incendiaries reduced port facilities to rubble. Morale plummeted. Civilians fled in panic. Soldiers questioned whether their families would survive, weakening both home front support and battlefield resolve. Japan attempted every defensive measure possible. Fighter intercepts KD-4s and J-2Ms engaged B-29s, but were outnumbered and often shot down in seconds. Anti-aircraft artillery, guns struggled to reach the low-altitude bombers with precision. Radar detection, primitive compared to U.S. electronic countermeasures. Alerts often came too late. In one harrowing encounter over Osaka, a group of B-29s encountered dozens of Japanese fighters. After 2 hours, only 3 Japanese aircraft returned. Japanese commanders realized the terrifying truth. Even with full effort, their air defenses were nearly irrelevant. The technological and logistical edge of the US B-29 campaign was overwhelming. One American mission report candidly noted, "Civilian morale is a target as much as any factory." Japanese planners were horrified. They had long followed Bushido principles, emphasizing honor, sacrifice, and loyalty. Yet now, thousands of civilians were dying nightly in ways the military could neither prevent nor retaliate against. For the first time, the Japanese leadership realized that winning the war was no longer about ships or planes. It was about survival itself. The devastation wasn't random. LeMay and his staff meticulously planned each raid. Flight paths optimized for minimal fuel use and maximum surprise. Crew coordination, multiple waves ensured continuous bombardment over multiple nights. Backup plans, alternate targets if weather or anti-aircraft fire disrupted missions. Japan's war planners began to see a grim pattern. The B-29 campaign was inexhaustible. Even when one wave was intercepted, others arrived within hours. The sheer scale of logistics, airfields, maintenance, fuel, and bombs overwhelmed Japan's ability to respond. By May 1945, LeMay's strategy had a devastatingly clear outcome. Major industrial cities were virtually destroyed. LeMay reflected on the success. "The only way to end this war swiftly is to make them understand they cannot survive in their cities. We will strike until they have no place left to hide." This turning point signaled a critical realization for Japan. The B-29 campaign could decide the war's outcome even before atomic weapons were deployed. It also forced desperate Japanese strategic discussions about evacuation, dispersal of industry, and even surrender ideas that had seemed impossible months earlier. By the summer of 1945, Japan's defenses were shattered, its cities burning, and its morale broken. But the campaign was far from over. The climactic raids and the final devastation would soon make history, leaving lessons in fire and ruin that would never be forgotten. Summer 1945, Japan was a nation under siege, its cities ablaze, its infrastructure shattered, its people terrified. Curtis LeMay's B-29 campaign had achieved something unprecedented, the systematic destruction of urban Japan. And yet, the climax of this relentless aerial offensive was about to unfold, a series of raids that would define history. This is where strategy, technology, and sheer determination converged into an almost unstoppable force. By mid-1945, LeMay had perfected his approach. Low-altitude, night raids, incendiary payloads, and carefully coordinated waves made B-29 attacks devastatingly effective. Cities that had been spared during early missions were now deliberate targets. Kobe Central Port facilities leveled, warehouses and homes incinerated Osaka, factories destroyed, civilian population in chaos Nagoya, industrial districts erased. Transportation crippled. Japanese commanders realized that every major urban center was now vulnerable, and their remaining anti-aircraft defenses were virtually symbolic. The psychological impact was immense. Civilians hid in shelters, many of which offered little protection from the relentless infernos. Soldiers returned to towns that no longer existed. Entire communities were reduced to ash. The culmination came with successive raids on Tokyo, following the first devastating March firebombing. LeMay's air crews had learned from earlier attacks, deploy incendiaries in tight patterns to maximize firestorm potential, exploit wind patterns to spread destruction across vast areas, bomb simultaneously from multiple directions to overwhelm defenses. By July and August 1945, Tokyo had been struck multiple times. The city's core industrial zones were obliterated, but residential districts suffered even more. The firestorms created temperatures high enough to melt metal and ignite even concrete structures, a terrifying testament to the destructive power of modern warfare. Japanese commanders wrote in desperate dispatches, "There is no place left to defend. Our cities are ash, and yet the enemy returns night after night. We cannot respond. We cannot recover." we are defeated in every sense. Tokyo alone, over 100,000 dead in March. Tens of thousands more in subsequent raids. Other cities, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, combined casualties, well over 150,000, millions displaced. With entire urban infrastructures destroyed, civilians endured unimaginable suffering, families separated, homes burned, food and water scarce, hospitals destroyed. The B-29 campaign didn't just destroy cities, it dismantled the psychological and social fabric of Japan. Japanese officers documented widespread demoralization. Soldiers lost the will to fight when their families were gone. Local leaders felt helpless as cities vanished overnight. The nation's resilience was being systematically broken. By late July 1945, Japanese military planners faced a stark reality. The Navy was largely neutralized, leaving the homeland vulnerable. The Air Force was depleted. Unable to challenge B-29 formations, industrial production was at a fraction of pre-war levels. Unable to replenish losses, civilians were dying in numbers never imagined. A key debate emerged in Tokyo. Should Japan continue to resist, hoping for a miraculous reprieve, or should they seek surrender to avoid total annihilation? The B-29 raids had effectively forced the Japanese leadership into a position where surrender became not just logical, but necessary. It wasn't just the atomic bomb that would compel capitulation. It was the accumulated destruction wrought by the Superfortress. LeMay's strategy had achieved what few military leaders thought possible. Total destruction of urban centers. Cities reduced to rubble, disrupting both industry and civilian life. Psychological warfare. Civilians and soldiers alike were demoralized, eroding support for continued resistance. Operational efficiency. Bases in the Marianas allowed continuous large-scale raids without overextending supply lines. Minimal American casualties, despite dangerous missions. The strategy reduced risk through planning, altitude, and formation tactics by combining technology, logistics, and ruthless planning. The United States had forced Japan to confront a reality no leader could ignore. Even Japanese generals who had once mocked the feasibility of such raids had to admit they have broken our cities and our spirit. There is no countermeasure left. We are defeated by the air alone. In the weeks leading up to Japan's surrender, the B-29 raids continued unabated. Cities burned, supply lines collapsed, and civilians fled in desperation. The combination of conventional firebombing and the looming atomic threat created a perfect storm of military, industrial, and psychological pressure. LeMay himself later reflected, the B-29 campaign was designed to end the war quickly. Its effectiveness proved that overwhelming aerial power could achieve in months what might otherwise have taken years of bloody fighting. Japan's surrender, on August 15, 1945, was the culmination of multiple factors. Yet the B-29 strategy had decisively set the stage. The destruction of Japan's cities, infrastructure, and morale made continued resistance impossible. The B-29 Superfortress had done more than drop bombs. It had shattered an empire's expectations, demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of American air power, and irrevocably altered the course of the Pacific War. But the story doesn't end with surrender. The aftermath of devastation, the lessons learned, and the unexpected consequences would continue to echo for generations. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Yet the echoes of Curtis LeMay's B-29 campaign lingered, not just in the rubble of cities, but in the minds of survivors, military planners, and historians. The destruction was absolute, but its lessons were even more profound. The final chapter of this story is not just about firestorms and bombers, it's about aftermath, reckoning, and the enduring legacy of a strategy that reshaped warfare forever. By the time the B-29 campaign had concluded, over 300,000 Japanese civilians dead from firebombings alone, millions displaced, living in makeshift shelters, or fleeing the ruins of their cities. Entire urban districts completely erased from the map. One survivor wrote years later, "We returned to the city we knew, but it was gone. Streets, houses, schools, all ashed. We survived, but everything else was lost." The physical destruction was matched by emotional devastation. Families were fractured, communities disbanded, and the trauma of firestorms haunted survivors for decades. Even Japanese military officers admitted that the raids had shattered morale and weakened the ability of the nation to continue fighting, making surrender inevitable. The B-29 campaign was not only a terror campaign, it was a surgical strike against Japan's industrial capacity. Factories producing aircraft, munitions, chemicals, and textiles were destroyed. Transportation hubs and communication networks collapsed. Ports and warehouses were reduced to rubble. Japanese military reports concluded, "Our industrial production is no longer sufficient to supply even half of what is required. The homeland is defenseless." What makes this shocking is that many Japanese commanders expected the American raids to be limited, sporadic, or icily countered. The reality of a sustained, efficient, and technologically advanced bombing campaign far exceeded any expectation. The B-29 strategy proved that air power alone could decisively cripple a nation's ability to wage war, a lesson that would influence global military planning for decades. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this campaign was how unexpected it was for Japanese military planners. They had underestimated American technological capabilities, pressurized cabins, long-range engines, and advanced bombing systems. They misjudged logistical mastery, not realizing the U.S. could sustain hundreds of sorties from the Marianas indefinitely. They failed to anticipate tactical innovation, such as low-altitude, incendiary raids. One Japanese general admitted in post-war interviews, "We could not believe what we were seeing. We had trained for high-altitude attacks, kamikaze defenses, and conventional bombardments, but this was beyond imagination." In essence, the Japanese military was blindsided not by numbers alone, but by innovation and daring strategy, a lesson echoed in modern military theory. Technology and strategy can outweigh sheer manpower. The B-29 campaign reshaped the rules of war. Strategic bombing as decisive warfare. Japan's collapse showed that targeting cities and infrastructure could break a nation without a prolonged land campaign. Integration of technology and tactics, pressurized cabins, remote gun turrets, and coordinated low-altitude raids proved that innovation could multiply the effectiveness of even a single weapon system. Psychological impact as a weapon. LeMay's targeting of civilian and industrial centers demonstrated how morale, fear, and chaos are critical components in modern warfare. The B-29 didn't just devastate Japan, it redefined strategic military thought. Lessons learned here influenced conflicts for decades, from Korea to Vietnam to modern air campaigns. It's impossible to discuss this campaign without acknowledging the immense human suffering. Entire families perished, cities were rendered unrecognizable, survivors carried trauma for generations. Yet, from a purely military perspective, the campaign achieved its objectives with remarkable efficiency. Historians note that the B-29 strategy significantly accelerated the end of the Pacific War, possibly reducing casualties that might have occurred during an invasion of the Japanese home islands. It's a sobering reminder: the most decisive military strategies often come with a profound human cost. The story of the B-29 campaign is one of innovation, audacity, and devastating consequence. Japan could not believe the scale, speed, and destructiveness of America's secret to strategic bombing until it was too late. Today, we remember both the brilliance of military strategy and the tragedy of civilian suffering, understanding that history's lessons are never one-sided. If you found this deep dive into the B-29 campaign enlightening, shocking, or thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of World War II, daring strategies, and history that changed the world forever, because the past has lessons we can't afford to forget, and the skies above. Japan in 1945 remind us of just how powerful innovation, courage, and determination can be, for better or for worse.